Robert, so we are going to start, and Yatsir is going to project your, is going to present the PowerPoint that you sent us. So sorry about all the technical difficulties, and thank you so much.
I'm sorry too.
Attendees.
I apologize as well.
And without further introduction, so Antonio, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Hello, Robert, and hello, María Eugenia. Well, I have to. Thank you very much, both of you, to participate in this session. I have and it's a pleasure to have you both. I have a challenge, which is that we don't have a simultaneous translation. Then I will try to combine Spanish and English. But of course, your presentation, Robert and Maru, are going to be in English. Then let me present in Spanish some things, and I will give you the to begin with your presentation, Robert. Okay? ¿Sí me oyen? Bueno, buenos días a todos. Le decía a los ponentes, al profesor Mendelsohn y a la profesora Ibarrarán, que sus presentaciones van a ser en inglés. Es muy complicado hacer una traducción simultánea por esta vía. Entonces lo que voy a hacer es combinar cuando sea necesario, y en la presentación, en la introducción, voy a hablar en español y después voy a tratar de traducir. Bueno, voy a hacer una síntesis de la presentación del profesor Mendelsohn, y le pedí a la profesora Ibarrarán que después de su presentación nos haga favor de hacer una síntesis de lo que expuso. Bueno, como saben, la mesa, esta sesión tiene que ver con la economía de la sustentabilidad. Empiezo presentando al profesor Mendelsohn. Es profesor del Departamento de Medio Ambiente de la Universidad de Yale y tiene un currículum extensísimo y es reconocido internacionalmente. Un ejemplo de ellos, bueno, ha hecho investigación sobre cambio climático y tiene trabajos que han contribuido a la literatura en general a nivel mundial, pero también tiene trabajos sobre México y sobre la agricultura de México. Entre otras cosas, tiene, bueno, muchísimas publicaciones sobre cambio climático, agricultura, y un reconocimiento que sintetiza la calidad de su trabajo. Es un premio que le otorgó el año pasado la American Economic Review por un artículo sobre la situación global, cambio climático y la agricultura. Nos va a hablar sobre, como les decía, sobre la propuesta de una economía, a partir de la economía y de los economistas, de un desarrollo sustentable. Como les decía, conoce a México y parte de su presentación va a ser sobre una reflexión sobre las medidas para promover la sustentabilidad en la economía mexicana. Paso ahora a presentar la palabra al profesor Mendelsohn. Professor Mendelsohn, I just introduce yourself and please begin your presentation. Thank you very much.
So it's a delight to be here, even though I guess here means we're not exactly here. I apologize for the problems we're going to have that I can't speak Spanish, so that's one problem. There also seems to be something wrong with our video, so that you cannot see me. So I apologize for that, but I have prepared some slides, and hopefully we can go through those slides together. So could we have the first slide?
Please.
Okay,
go.
so please go ahead. So what we're going to talk about today is sustainability for Mexico. And one of the things that's kind of interesting about sustainability is that it's everybody likes the idea. We all want to do it. But unfortunately, sustainability is one of those things that is not well defined. And so if you actually want to do management with sustainability, you have to actually define exactly what it means. When is something more sustainable? When is it less sustainable? If you need to define it in order to actually use it as a management device. And there's a debate in the literature between whether sustainability should simply be non-declining outcomes, and that's the definition of it, or whether sustainability actually should be the maximization of the present value of all your resources over an infinite horizon. So the first definition is what many people in the sustainability field thinks is the correct definition. The second definition is what economists think is the correct definition. And we don't agree with each other. And there are some circumstances where we would do completely the opposite thing. Could I have the next slide? So what's attractive about non-declining flows? The idea is that you'll maintain everything without change, and that's wonderful because nothing will deteriorate. But the problem is that simply not deteriorating is not a particularly attractive goal for a society. Most societies would actually like things to improve over time. And there's nothing about the definition of sustainability that encourages improvement. It simply refuses to have any deterioration. So it kind of idolizes a world that happened before we industrialized. There's no capital accumulation, there's no economic growth, no population growth, and this is a sustainable world for many people. And it turns out that part of sustainability is you would not be allowed to use non-renewable resources. You couldn't use fossil fuels, you couldn't use your deep aquifers, you wouldn't be allowed to mine metals or minerals, because all those things would reduce the stock. And if it reduces the stock, then it's not sustainable. So one of the things we know about a pre-industrial society, although some people think that was just wonderful, is that it could not support very many people. At most, you could support about 1 billion people on the planet. But most of the people in pre-industrial societies, most of them were just dead poor. And only a very small fraction of people were actually not poor in a pre-industrial society. So if you don't want to get stuck in a permanent bad situation, the idea is you want to be talking about improvement. And that's what economists like to think about. If in an economist world, if your economy doesn't grow at all, yeah, you're considered a failure. Economics is designed to try to see if we can improve our state of life over time, rather than just keep it constant. The next slide. So what we have in mind is we're going to maximize the present value of all resources. So some resources you're going to use up, but the idea is that you're going to try to get the most you possibly can over the longest time period out of those resources. And this includes both things that are sold and bought in marketplaces, as well as things that are outside the market, the non-market resources that can't be managed by markets. In both those cases, we're trying to maximize their value. We're going to use non-renewable resources, but we're going to use them to try to maximize the value to society. So we're going to let markets produce private goods that they're very good at doing. They can produce and allocate private goods exceptionally well. And then we're going to rely on governments to produce goods which are commonly shared amongst us, that are not bought and sold in markets, that you basically, it's very difficult to develop a market for them. So for those, the government's job is to manage those for society at large. So things like trying to control pollution, trying to figure out what's the right number of wildlife, how much habitat you want to have, how to move water around across all the possible uses. Those might be things the government would do. And then one of the other things government will address, or at least think about, is what does it want to do about poverty? It should care not just about the aggregate welfare for society at large, but also something about the distribution. Next slide. So one of the things that environmental economics is very much about is it's very much about values. It's trying to argue that there's relative values for some market goods over others. Some market goods are more important than other market goods, and that's what prices tell you. High prices means that's something that's a very valuable resource. A low price means it's a much less valuable resource. In non-market resources, they're not bought and sold in markets. There's no prices for them, but that concept's still there. Even in non-market resources, some of those resources are worth more to us than to others. And so it's important that we actually recognize we have values for these things, and that we're going to sometimes face moments when there's trade-offs. There's trade-offs between having more markets, market goods, having more non-market goods, having one non-market good versus another non-market good. There'll be trade-offs between them, and we need values to decide exactly how to make those trade-offs. So one of the things we're going to talk about is values, and it's a fundamental aspect of the economics of this problem. One of the things you tend to see in the sustainability literature is, other than a huge value being placed on keeping the status quo, they generally don't place values on resources. They simply measure them in physical units. So how many tons of this pollution, how many hectares of forest, how many cubic meters of water. But it turns out that tons of pollution matter. It depends on where they're located, where they're happening, which forests matter. So some forests are much more valuable than others. And water, it makes a huge difference where in Mexico you are in terms of how valuable that water is going to be. If you're in a major metropolitan area, that water is incredibly valuable. If you're in a very remote place, the water is much less valuable. So it's important to talk about values. So let's go on. So one of the things that's important for Mexico is Mexico should make all these decisions about what to produce and how to produce them using Mexican values. So one of the mistakes that sometimes happens is that developed countries, America, Europe, lead in the research, and we find out what's the right values for America, and we tend to impose those values on everybody else. So there's interesting things about the first world developed world research, but one of the things that you should notice is you don't want to use American values when you're making Mexican decisions. You want to use Mexican values. You want to use the values of the Mexican people to make decisions in your country. Next slide. So let's talk about water. This is a particularly important issue for Mexico. A lot of the country is semi-arid, although you have some wet places. Water turns out to be very heavy and inexpensive to move around, so it stays inside a watershed. So just because there might be a lot of water in the Yucatan or something, it doesn't mean there's a lot of water in northern Mexico. So one of the things that's important is in every single watershed, water be allocated carefully. And if the water is very scarce, the idea is that you want to make sure it's getting to the high-valued users. So one of the things that's true about Mexico and most of the world is most of the world uses its water for irrigation of low-valued farming. And what's happening in Mexico is very little of the water is actually getting to higher valued users. So there's two kinds of higher value users. There's urban users, so that's just people in cities. So that's your drinking water. That's the water you need to survive in a city. And there's industrial users, which put a very high value on water. And right now, most of that water is being used for low valued farming and not enough of it for these other uses. So Mexico could get more out of the water that they've got by shifting some of that water towards higher valued users. Next slide. So what you want to do is you want to maximize the value of water to everybody in the society. And what that means is you want to move water from low valued users towards high valued users. So a high valued user, for example, is drinking water, industrial water. These are super high values. The really low valued water is gravity-fed agriculture to grow low-valued crops. So even within agriculture, some of that water is being used for much more valuable uses, and some is being used for very low-valued uses. And the idea is you want to move water from low to high-valued uses. And in drought years, you want to do that even more so. You want to, in a drought year, you want to take the water away from the low-valued uses and make sure that you protect the high-valued uses. Next slide. But there's two ways you can move water around. In Mexico, effectively, the government owns the water. It technically would just take the water away from a low-valued user and give it to a high-valued user. But that means low-valued users will lose out, and many low-valued users are also quite poor. So it might not be attractive for the government simply to seize the water from a low-valued use and give it to a high-valued use who might be a rich person. It might be much more attractive that the government establish that you have existing water rights to the water you have now, and that you be allowed to trade it. So what is the difference between trading water and just seizing water? Trading water means that somebody who's a low-valued user doesn't have to give it up. It would be a voluntary action that they take. And the idea is that high-valued users would be the ones that would pay low-valued users to give up their water. So the beauty of trading is that the low-valued users would not lose their right to water. they would simply decide whether they'd rather have money or whether they'd rather have the water. And that would be a decision that each low-value user could make for themselves. So the beauty of allowing trades is that you still will get water moving from low-value to high-value use, but high-value users will pay for it. So we're not going to make low-value users any worse off than they are to start with. Next slide. So the big thing is irrigation water. That's where most of the water in Mexico is going. And a lot of that water is being used in gravity-fed irrigation systems. And it turns out just a very tiny bit of that water actually gets into the crops. So there's lots of things farming can do, agriculture can do, if it had less water. One of the things it can do is it can substitute capital for water. And what that means is instead of doing gravity-fed irrigation, you might use a sprinkler system. And if it turns out water is super scarce, you might not have a sprinkler at all. You might actually have a drip system that actually carefully drops each drop of water on top of a crop. And the other thing you want to do is move from low-value crops to high-value crops. So you wouldn't want to be using irrigation to grow fodder, for example, for animals. You only want to use it for something that is high value, that gives a high net revenue to society and to the farmer. And so one of the things that can happen even within agriculture is if it gets less water, there's various ways it can adapt to that fact and still get by, still grow lots of food. Next slide. Another really important topic that's related to water, that is water, is what do you do with underground aquifers? So one thought is what do you do with your surface water, the river water? Another thought is, well, you've got water that's basically big lakes that are underground, and the question is how to manage them. This is a really big, important issue for Mexico City. Technically, these non-renewable sources, these underground aquifers are non-renewable because you're taking water out a lot faster than water is going back. So they're being depleted. And one of the problems is there's no price on the value of that stock. And so the water under Mexico City, is being depleted a little too quickly. And that's resulting in lots of problems like land subsidence. But mostly the problem is that it's resulting in the aquifers being depleted too quickly. And so one of the things that Mexico can do to try to help itself with that is to price the underground water, but also Mexico City desperately needs a renewable supply of water. And where can it get a renewable supply of water? It could ask for more rain, but that is not forthcoming these days. So the other place to get water is from farmers. So this is an example of how Mexico City can solve this problem. If it could buy water from farmers, the farmers could be better off because Mexico City can pay them more than they can ever get using that water. And then Mexico City itself would have a much more reliable and larger supply of water. Next. So another big issue is flooding. It's hard to imagine why a country that is very dry has problems with flooding, but it turns out you get hit by tropical cyclones, and that results in an enormous amount of water being dropped in very short periods of time. And a lot of that water just creates floods and can't be captured. It's just too much water at once. And I was surprised to see that 40% of the total amount of rainfall in Mexico is actually coming from these tropical cyclones. So one of the things that's problematic about that is you're getting lots of flooding damage from it. But the other thing that's problematic is that means 40% of the water you're getting, you're not actually using. You can't keep it. You can't capture it. So one of the things to think about is whether it's possible to create dams to try to harness a lot of the water that's coming in from these tropical cyclones. And that means creating dams in places where sometimes that dam is going to be empty behind the dam, but other times it's going to fill up when a storm actually happens. And what that would do is it would control flood damage, but it would also provide more water for Mexico to have. Next slide. Another issue about water is water pollution. So many times when you use water, you pollute it when you're using it. You put impurities in it. So urban water puts various different kinds of impurities into their water. Even water that is used by farmers, it comes out and it's often full of saline. And so one of the questions is whether Mexico could consider doing more water treatment. not because it's a great idea to have just clean rivers for their own sake, but mostly because you might be able to use that water again if you treat it. So it's possible that if you took urban water and you got it through a treatment plant at relatively low cost, you might make that water suitable to use as irrigation water. So that's one idea about trying to increase the supply, is to try to reuse the water more than once. And then another issue that is an issue for Mexico is keeping drinking water clean. So drinking water is a little different from keeping every single river clean. Drinking water is what you're actually drinking. So one way you can look at that is really expensive capital treatment plants. So you spend a lot of money on water treatment plants so that cities would have clean water. But another thing that's very important to understand is another solution is just making sure that poor households that don't have access to piped water, making sure they have access to chlorine tablets. So that's a very inexpensive way a relatively poor household can take water that's actually not safe to drink and make it safe. So there are expensive ways to do this that cities should do, and then there's much less expensive ways that might make much more sense in more rural and poor households. The next slide. And another topic that's important to understand is air pollution. All air pollution needs to be priced. We need to find out how harmful is our emissions. And one thing we found out is that emissions, how harmful they are, it depends on how toxic they are. That's one thing that's really important. It turns out most of the greatest toxicity comes from small particulates. So we want to make sure that pollutants that become small particulates and small particulates themselves face a higher price. But the other thing that's terribly important is that emissions that expose more people should have a much higher price. And what that means is that how bad an emission is, how harmful an emission is, depends on how many people are exposed to it. And if you do an emission in a city, you're going to expose a lot more people than if you do that very same emission in a rural area. So one of the things this is saying is location matters a lot with air pollution. Next slide. So just as an example, you've got Mexico City with 21 million people, and Guadalajara and Monterrey are also very big cities. If you look at the population density in Mexico City, it's like 40,000 people for every mile squared. But if you look at rural Mexico, it's just 37. So if you do an emission in Mexico City, you're likely to expose 1,000 times more people to that pollutant than if you do that same emission in rural Mexico. In other words, the marginal damage of a ton of emission, of harmful emission, is 1,000 times bigger if it's done in Mexico City. So what this is saying is Mexico might not have all the money in the world to spend on emission control everywhere, and therefore it ought to focus or prioritize trying to reduce emissions in its largest metropolitan areas. And if Mexico's like the United States, a great deal of the emissions from the country are coming in the metropolitan areas because that's where the GDP is. And so what that means from a regulatory point of view is Mexico will get big payoffs by reducing the small particulates, the sulfur dioxide, and ammonia emissions that are happening in the largest metropolitan areas. So it's not tonnage that actually needs to be gotten rid of, it's damage. And the tons that are emitted in cities are much more harmful than the tons everywhere else. And that should be where Mexico concentrates its efforts. Next slide. So one of the things where the whole world is involved in is climate change mitigation. Mexico is just one of many countries that emit climate change or emit greenhouse gases. The problem with greenhouse gases is every time you try to control a ton of mitigation, you're really helping out the entire world, but you're not necessarily helping out your own country so much. So basically, I would argue Mexico should not do more than its fair share, but Mexico might want to do its fair share of mitigation as part of some international effort to control greenhouse gases in general. And that would imply a reduction in reliance on coal and trying to find renewable energy sources, wind, solar, bioenergy, that Mexico might have in abundance and try to take advantage of them. And it also means you might want to manage some of the forests to try to store more carbon in them. Next slide. Next slide. So climate adaptation, oh, sorry, I went too fast. Climate adaptation is something Mexico should pay attention to. The world is going to do some mitigation, but it's pretty obvious climate's still going to warm. So every country is going to have to adapt to how much climate changes. So it's in every single country own interest to do that. The idea is the adaptations you want to do are things that will make Mexico better off if the world changes. So if the world gets warmer, if the precipitation changes, that might mean that Mexico should change some of the things they're doing. And it's in Mexico's interest to do it. That is, Mexico will increase its own net revenue if it adapts to this warmer world. And so the idea is to look at ways that Mexico can adapt. So look at how you might change how you do agriculture as this climate actually changes. The urban areas might want to look at whether they should do more cooling in the future because it'll make them better off. If you're living along the sea, you're going to have to deal with rising seas and perhaps storms changing. So you need to look at whether more coastal resilience makes sense. And the idea with adaptation is you simply track how the weather changes. You track how the tides change. And then you ask yourself, well, would I be better off doing anything differently because of these changes that I'm seeing? So this is called reactive adaptation in the sense that you wait and see how climate changes, and then you adapt, rather than proactive adaptation, which is you adapt in advance. I don't actually recommend doing proactive adaptation because we don't really know how quickly and how exactly climate will change in each place. But doing a reactive adaptation makes all the sense in the world. And all it really requires in terms of monitoring is just keeping track of how your weather is changing. So it's just a matter of paying attention to the fact that the world is changing. And as the world changes, you might want to reevaluate some of the choices you're making to make yourself better off. Next slide. So there's also questions about how Mexico should manage its timber. In general, I think it does a good job with this. But what it wants to focus on is maximizing the present value of that resource. So some of the timber is being used for market output, and the idea is to maximize the value of that market output. Other parts of your timber might be used for other purposes, like protecting natural forests. And then the question is just how much of natural forest do you want to protect? So you want to figure out where it makes sense to have plantations. You want to figure out how long the rotation should be. And you might want to decide that some places shouldn't be harvested at all. They should remain natural. So these are just some of these decisions are market decisions, and the market should be let free to make those choices. And some of them are government decisions to protect habitat and harvest and carbon stocks in the forest, in which case the government should decide just how much it wants to spend on these. Next slide. So conservation is something that Mexico might want to think about, that there's some reasons why it might want to do some conservation just to protect things that Mexicans think are important. So one of the questions is, what's the domestic value that Mexico places on specific ecosystems? And you certainly want to protect things that you think are important. The other possibility is that there might be some things that have international value. That is, there's value to the systems outside of Mexico. And one of the things that I would suggest is trying to look for ways to get outsiders to pay. If the outsiders say there's something wonderful about a forest in Mexico because butterflies sit there, the idea is that maybe you could get outsiders to contribute to protecting those forests. You could charge fees for visitors from places outside the world, outside of Mexico, who are coming to Mexico to look at conservation. You could start having fees at airports, possibly tourist fees, or specifically at conservation sites. You could have fees to visit. One of the things that I think is a good idea is to try to get foreign contributions for conservation sites to the extent that Mexico is protecting something that is of value to other people, not just to your own citizens, but to others. The idea is they should pay for that if that's something that they care about. Next slide. So the bottom line is there's lots of things that can be done to increase Mexican sustainability. And there's things that Mexico can definitely do better. But the idea is that you want to use the values of Mexico to make decisions for Mexico. So I wish you good luck with that, and I hope it all goes well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. What I will do is, as I was telling, and we hope we are lucky enough to get a sustainability in the Mexican economy. Anyway, what I will do is to try to make a synthesis of your presentation, of the presentation of Professor Mendelsohn, and then I will give the microphone to Profesor Ibarrarán. La idea es, me voy a tomar muy poco tiempo para alguno del público que no domine bien el inglés. Y también mi propósito es enmarcar lo que va a hacer la profesora Ibarrarán, es discutir en la presentación del profesor Mendelsohn, y se va a enfocar sobre todo en la parte de la evaluación. El profesor Mendelsohn discute al principio cuál es la noción de un desarrollo económico sustentable o cuál es la sostenibilidad. Hay dos casos extremos. Uno de ellos es lo que llama el doctor Mendelsohn la visión estrecha, y la otra visión es la más amplia, que implícitamente es la que, o explícitamente más bien, es la que recomienda el profesor Mendelsohn que tome México. Básicamente, y como sabemos, la visión más estrecha, según su término, es la que pretende, o su visión es minimizar el uso de los recursos naturales. Esto implica, en el caso más extremo, no aumentar la acumulación de capital, ni el crecimiento, ni que crezca la población, y muy poco crecimiento económico. Como les decía, la posición del profesor Mendelsohn es la amplia, que parte de una visión de maximizar en el largo plazo el uso de los recursos naturales y también los bienes y servicios del mercado. En esta visión, una componente fundamental es la valoración. Como sabemos, los recursos naturales y los servicios, y los buenos y malos servicios ambientales no tienen un costo, no tienen precio. Entonces hay un tema fundamental que señala el profesor Mendelsohn, que tiene que ver con la valoración. Después de eso, el profesor Mendelsohn presenta una reflexión sobre lo que sugeriría que debe de hacer México con esta visión, ¿no? Con esta visión amplia de la sustentabilidad, y habla sobre el agua, que es uno de los temas que ha trabajado muchísimo el profesor Mendelsohn, sobre el agua, las distintas fuentes de agua, la de río superficial y el agua profunda, y ahí hace una serie de sugerencias, de recomendaciones de cómo asignar de forma más eficiente el recurso agua. Por ejemplo, es el caso de la agricultura, que es en México y en todo el mundo es el sector que más consume agua, y cómo hacer que se valore de tal forma que se utilice o se canalice en actividades que sean más productivas que la agricultura. Los otros temas que trabaja, y nada más los voy a señalar, es la cuestión de la contaminación del aire, la mitigación y adaptación del cambio climático. Al respecto, lo que propone es que la visión más práctica, más conveniente, es que México tome una posición reactiva al cambio climático en vez de previsiva. También presentó sus reflexiones sobre el sector forestal, que a su parecer México al respecto está haciendo un buen uso de los recursos forestales y perdón, y al final platica sobre la conservación. Una cosa básica con lo que quiero rematar es que para la propuesta del profesor Mendelsohn es que en México se valoricen los recursos naturales y que a partir de esa valoración desde México se hagan las medidas más adecuadas para la sustentabilidad. Con eso termino para darle la palabra a la profesora Ibarrarán. Voy a hablar rápidamente sobre su trayectoria profesional. Ella tiene el doctorado en Geografía con especialidad en estudios de energía y medio ambiente de la Universidad de Boston. Es profesora investigadora de la Universidad Iberoamericana en Puebla y directora ahí en esta universidad del Instituto de Investigaciones en Medio Ambiente. También es consejera social de la Coordinación de Evaluación de la Política Nacional de Cambio Climático y es miembro y ha trabajado durante varios años. Es miembro de la y investigadora asociada del Centro Mario Molina. Sus publicaciones giran en torno de cuestiones de desarrollo sustentable y economía sustentable. Es una experta en la evaluación de impactos a partir de un enfoque multisectorial, de enfoques multisectoriales y sobre todo de modelos de equilibrio general. Y en vez de detenerme más en su currículum, le doy la palabra a la profesora Ibarrarán. Bienvenida. Puedes empezar, por favor.
Presentar en inglés, ¿ok? Y bueno, las preguntas pueden ser después en inglés o en español sin ningún problema. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. Hold on one second. And I'm very happy to share this panel with you, Robert. And what we decided with the organizers to do is that I would be like a discussant of your presentation. So here are some thoughts I've had reviewing what you were going to present, and I think this can be a very interesting dialogue. So there are several things that I certainly agree with you. I'm also an economist, and I do think that sustainability can do with non-declining outcomes in the sense that technology is there also to increase to fill the gap when you reduce resources, and that is one other way to define it. And Mexico should definitely go for a broad definition of sustainability, where it's not only conservationist, because we do need to extract all these resources and make the most out of it for the growth. The second thing is. I also believe that markets play a central role in pricing and in the allocation of resources, and that economic valuation of environmental goods and services, as well as of quality of the environment, is crucial for decision making. I think I'm an environmental economist as well, and I really think that good decisions need price valuation of resources, and that translates into prices, and that makes resources go one way or another. I also think now the issues are like the devil is in the details, right? So maximization of present value of all resources over an infinite horizon. It looks like a very easy thing to do, but there are very many things to discuss around that. The first one is what discount rate should be used. There's this idea that very low discount rates should be used for environmental goods and services. It's a long-term issue, so very low discount rates should be used. But there's this discussion with whoever is going to put the money in, what are the opportunity costs of those resources. So this is something that it seems trivial, but it's very, very important. Now, another issue is who makes the valuation. It's like the Mexican government makes the valuation, and that is to maximize the value for society. But again, these things are very complex. I'm pretty sure that valuation would be very different if the government makes it at the federal level, at the state level, or at the local level. It also makes a big difference if the private sector makes the valuation. Simply the rate they would choose would be very different. Or if communities make the valuation. So I think that these things are something to take into consideration. Now, here's a question that I had since I read your presentation, and then now you presented it. What are those Mexican values? And if you could provide an example of other countries' values, because it's not clear to me. And if there are Mexican values, again, whose values are those? Is it the government levels, the national or foreign private sector, communities, producers, consumers? Mostly they will differ. And I will go into an example towards the end of the presentation on this. And is it possible that these values go against maximizing present value? We have many cases now, for example, the Morelos project, where there's a government wanting to do one thing and the local communities wanting something very different. And probably to both, they are maximizing their present value. But those present values are not the same, right? Because of the discount rates, the valuation they have of the resources. Maybe the government is thinking about the fools that are going to go through the territory, whereas the others are thinking of the land that they're going to lose or the sacred sites they're going to lose. So I think that this is important. And what aspects should be taken into consideration into the value to maximize? Financial, the economic in terms of the effect on the whole region, the environmental, the social, or the political. The political play a significant role. Local governments have 3 years only to govern, where state governments and the president and the federal have 6. So their time horizons also differ significantly. Here are some facts. When you were mentioning the issue that water, for example, should go to the high value users. So here we have some facts. 12.5 to 15 million people, mostly in areas, do not have to potable water or sewage. 30% of the country's population, and that's almost 40 million, do not have access to enough quantity and quality of water. That's something that you were mentioning some minutes ago. And then we have a significant amount of water under very poor quality. And even though we do have treatment plants, like 5,000 nationwide, about 75% are abandoned due to high operating cost. And 10 to 30% of construction costs go to bribes. Other facts that are very important is who the users are. About 80% of water goes to the agricultural sector at a zero price. But mostly it goes to big producers, and many of them export products. So how can you break those practices of water pricing with all that water going free for those agricultural producers that are interest groups? They're not the poor peasants, because poor peasants mostly don't get water from concessions. This can lead to severe problems, like, for example, the Cochabamba water wars in Bolivia that were a big issue in the 90s. And here are some questions that I would like to see how that is. What means high value users other than market prices of final goods they produce? You were mentioning industry or high value agriculture. But how can water security, food and health be factored in? That is also something valuable that should be taken into account. In the Mexican Constitution, there were some reforms to the Constitution, and it includes the access to water, health, and a clean environment as basic human rights that are by law given consecrated in the Constitution, and the government has to make sure people get those, have access to all those goods, right? However, we have 5.5 million are subsistence farmers to some extent, and at least 2 million are that they live off what they produce, and they need the water for that as well. And there are other things that maybe have to be put in as well, like even if they produce low value products, the rural being in self-sufficient producers, it produces employment. They might produce nutritious food variety, and they can protect ecosystem diversity. And another issue here is how can Mexico and politicians particularly afford to have low value users get less water in drought years? So there are often marginalized communities in very poor areas, and this is true also in urban areas. In urban areas, obviously, the ones that get the least water are the poor. Okay. Here, I just wanted to discuss some other issues related to water. Many of our underground aquifers are urban and rural problem. It's not only an urban problem. Maybe some are in the rural areas and they're so overexploited. In Mexico, we have had very bad experiences with water pricing policy for urban dwellers. The public service is usually deficient and intermittent, and they often apply bulk pricing without metering. This is something that obviously has to change, but it's there. But when the private sector goes in and operates the system, they usually have huge price increases, and they don't necessarily have potable water quality. In terms of renewables of water, I was wondering, how are you thinking about this part? There are huge investments required. Obviously, if you price water and you charge water to users, and particularly to urban dwellers, then you can have access to resources to invest in this sector, in what treatment. But it's it's not an easy thing given all the trends that we have been following. There's also incentives for rainwater collection and prevent flooding, but cost-wise, this is very difficult. This is very complicated, and I'd like to see what example you have of other cities that do control the huge amounts of water that come in through extreme events, and that can be then harnessed, as you were saying. Mexico, in terms of water pollution, Mexico treats less than 40% of its water. And we basically have primary and secondary treatment plants. So, as you mentioned, potable water is not there, is not in the quality that is required, and there is disregard for norms. So both municipal authorities and the industrial sector, most of their water, their residual water, goes into the rivers and pollutes them. So that's a very pressing problem that we have, both aquifers and water pollution. And it just for discussion, we're now having an open discussion again on the national law for water. There have been many attempts to figure this out and come up with a. In 2015, we had, it seemed that there was going to be a proposal again in 2018. Now there are 5 initiatives in Congress to be discussed. Some say that it will be discussed. Some say it will not be until after the midterm elections. So it would be in 2022, or some say after in the next government period, because it's a very hot issue. So it's been 8 years since human rights to water was enshrined in the Constitution, but since this is not considered in the law, it's really not imperative. So now there are 5 initiatives in Congress, 2 by Morena, that's the ruling party, 1 by Agua para Todos, that's like a citizen proposal, 1 by Partido del Trabajo, and 1 by Partido Acción Nacional. And here are what the views are clashing on. And maybe this is one that's the central. One is water to satisfy people's needs, and this is related to human rights, versus the economic value to generate wealth. And this, to some extent, seems to be impossible to reconcile. And this is something that your presentation centered very much on, because it was mostly centered on economic value to generate wealth. So how do you propose to bring these things together? Because otherwise there's no way that there will be a law to satisfy both visions. Then there's also partisan groups, civil society, national firms, international firms, each for what their particular views are. And then and that's why some of the 2015 and 2018 laws did not prosper, is because of the concessions. You were talking about markets so that poor low value users could transfer water to high value users by selling their rights. And the problem here has been seen that even if it's not low value users, but there's been even speculation in the market. So banks and firms get water for agricultural use. That's what the government allows them, the Conagua. But then those concessions or those water rights are sold maybe to mining companies or to manufacturing companies. And then there's no way to track the use they give and the pollution they cause. And this is a big issue between all the different initiatives. Obviously, the PAN initiative is more like 50 years and then renewal, whereas Agua para Todos is 2 years and up to 5 to 10, and then renewal. And this obviously has a huge impact in terms of investment because of the certainty that it can give. So I'm not saying one is better than the other. It's just these clashing views on how concessions should work versus how they work and how could they be regulated. And well, I think that the other issues that you were mentioning, I'm just taking 2 more, is the climate change mitigation. We have goals, we have NDCs, but the energy policy for coal and fuel oil that this government is promoting is certainly in detriment of the natural gas and the renewables. However, there are major programs involved, and this is one of this can be one of those examples where the government doesn't even have the same views as communities, as socials, as civil society. The other one is, for example, timber. There should be organized optimal forest management, but there's also organized crime in the region, which makes it very difficult. And there are some places that are basically lost to them. And then there are the communities that are defending other values within the timber sector. So these are like, again, some examples of how views clash and how it's very much more difficult. So what is missing here? I think that the context, particular contexts are very important, because if we generalize things, theoretically they make so much sense. And I agree to the concept you were mentioning, but the context makes a lot of difference. Socioeconomic conditions of the regions make a lot of difference. The rights of maybe prior to these times were so much neglected and could be neglected, but they're very, very vocal, and they have rights in the laws that they are able, now they have a very high mobilizing capacity and going to international tribunals, and these things have to be taken care seriously. There's also the issue of governance, that governance is not only the formal actors, but also the informal actors that are very important to be taken into consideration. And to what extent the rule of law applies. There's many laws, for example, pollution-wise, and that is not observed. So the rule of law and the commitment for the governments to make it happen, that is also very important. So I think that these are just some issues that we have to rethink. And I think that sustainability, therefore, is very hard to achieve in terms of all these caveats, but it is necessary to take it seriously and act accordingly. Well, thank you very much.
Many thanks, Professor Ibarrarán. Thanks. And the following part will be to take some other questions. I will add some questions to both of you, and then I will pass I will present some questions from the public. One of the things that Professor Ibarrarán considers in her comments is something related to political economy. And I will make questions related to that, which is based on some examples. I think a year ago or so, the government tried to put a tariff to superficial water users for agricultural production, and this was not possible. This is one example, a clear example about the problems related to political economy that measures for sustainable development face. The other one is the other example is the controversy which has just rise and the violence that happened 2 days ago related to the agreement between Mexico and the U.S. to distribute the water of the Rio Bravo Basin. And this is an example of problems that has to be added in some cases where natural resources such as the Rio Bravo Basin has. Another example is, I don't know what's going to happen, but another example as well in the world is the construction of the dam in the Rio Nilo, which is going to be affected Egypt, for example. The other one, which is an example of the problems that Professor Ibarrarán talked about in Mexico, is the controversy about the Maya train that I suppose Professor Mendelsohn knows about it. That's it, and I will begin to, well, let me summarize my comments in Spanish. Básicamente, los comentarios de la doctora Ibarrarán se relacionaron con dos temas fundamentales: cómo valorar a los recursos naturales que no tienen precios y cómo enfrentar esto a raíz de las heterogeneidad y de los niveles de agentes que están involucrados, también incluyendo los derechos de propiedad de los recursos naturales, etcétera. Y la otra es el reto que tiene en términos legales y los problemas que hay en México de aplicar medidas de sustentabilidad. Mis preguntas tienen que ver también, y yo las planteo en términos de la economía política, y ejemplifiqué las cuestiones sobre el agua que todos ustedes conocen en relación a la controversia y la imposibilidad que hubo de cobrar una tarifa a los productores que usan agua irrigada hace un año más o menos en el Congreso. El otro ejemplo lo tenemos muy reciente, que trasciende las fronteras de México, que es la distribución del agua que México se comprometió a pasar a Estados Unidos, y la violencia que sucedió a partir de hace unos 2-3 días. Y también, ese problema del agua tiene que ver, mencionaba, con otro caso internacional muy importante, es la construcción de la presa abajo del río Nilo, arriba del río Nilo, y los efectos que puede tener en la oferta de agua para Egipto. En fin, básicamente es eso, ya las planteé en inglés, y tengo algunas preguntas ya aquí anotadas que las voy a plantear a los ponentes en inglés. Algunas están en inglés, otras no. Para empezar, una de los participantes, Elizabeth Hernández, me pide una intervención. Me temo que va a ser imposible porque está diseñada como hay muchísimos participantes, entre otras razones, va a ser muy difícil, y me disculpo muchísimo con usted de no poderle dar un espacio para que participe. Lo que puede hacer, y la invito a hacer alguna pregunta, si tiene alguna pregunta en relación a la presentación, a las presentaciones que acabamos de escuchar. There are some other questions, Professor Mendelsohn, one of which is, do you consider that by increasing ambitions, measures for mitigation and adaptation will enhance the agreement, the commitments of the countries of Mexico? I don't know if the question is for Mexico, but all these, to enhance these measures will help to enhance the commitments that Mexico has in the Paris Agreement. The other question has to do with the big health crisis and problems that COVID-19 has caused in all over the world, but especially in these developed countries. And the question is that, do you consider that by increasing, it's the same in the context of, the same question, but in the context of COVID-19. There's another comment which, I will allow you to answer, Professor Mendelsohn, the comments that Professor Ibarrarán presented, as well as these questions related to the Paris Agreement commitments, and I will have the time to organize the other questions. Professor Mendelsohn, please.
Okay. Those are lots of questions. I appreciate very much Professor Ibarrarán's comments. She's absolutely correct that this is most of the things I have suggested are things which in the abstract are good ideas, but the question is, how will they actually be implemented? And the details of how they're implemented are terribly important, because a good idea can be done very poorly and lead to a very bad outcome if it's not done carefully. So in general, when I was talking about trying to move water from low value to high value, it's actually, in some sense, trying to make some sense out of all the conflicting rules that Mexico has. On the one hand, Mexico wants to give property rights to a certain amount of water so that everybody in Mexico has some. And that's actually quite consistent with what I had in mind, was that everybody starts with well-defined property rights to their water. And then you were saying, how do you possibly work out who's the low valued and who's the high valued? Well, if the property rights can be well-defined, so that everybody knows what they've got to start with, and in particular, if you make certain that we're starting in a position where everybody has the minimum amount they need to survive, then what I'm suggesting is that they simply be given the right to trade the water that they're given. So if a family is saying, well, all the water I'm using now is the drinking water I need to survive for the rest of our lives, they're not going to trade that water. It's just too valuable. That's a super high valued use. But if it turns out that some of the water they're given is whether they want to have a big lawn or a small lawn, they might say, well, gee, if there's somebody else here who could use this water and use it for a lot of value, and the lawn's not that important to me, the trading would mean that they would give up their lawn in order to be paid. And the idea is the high value user would define itself as being somebody who's willing to pay for it. So if the high value user won't pay for the value of the water, there won't be a trade. So the beauty of the trading is that you don't have the government trying to figure out whose values are important, whose aren't. The idea is that people can decide for themselves how important different uses of the water that they've been allocated are to them, and they will give it up if it turns out the market's going to give them more money than it's actually worth to them. So this is a way of trying to protect people's rights, because we're starting with a certain amount of property rights, and yet move the final allocation towards a more efficient thing. Because if somebody really has a high valued use, they'll pay a lot of money to get that water, and so they'll be able to convince people to give their water up. You make an excellent point about, well, should this be a yearly thing? Every year we decide, or whether it should be a long-term thing. I think that that's an important detail, and I think one of the things you're kind of hinting is that maybe some trades should be long-term. Some trades should guarantee that if you make a huge capital investment, you're going to get the water you need to make that capital investment work. But clearly, some trades should be annual, because you want to have some flexibility to deal with droughts, to deal with things which are only 1 year long events. And you want some flexibility and to move the water around in those circumstances. So some of the trades probably should be a year-long thing. And an example of a scheme that worked is one of the great droughts in California. They actually, the state bought the water from the low-valued agricultural users there, who are basically growing, using irrigation water to grow fodder. And they bought that water away from them, and what they paid those farmers was the value of that water for fodder. So the farmers were fine. They got cash instead of the water. And what that meant was that the urban and industrial users in California did not have to make deep sacrifices to get through that drought. Now, California didn't remember that that was such a success, so the next governor didn't do that, and insisted that water come out of the urban and industrial users in California. And that resulted in a very large damage associated with a subsequent drought. But again, these are just things that, the idea is that we want to try to use things which move us towards sustainability. One of the things you've teased me about is, are we going to get there to 100% tomorrow, to 100% perfect sustainability? No, we probably can't. But one of the things that suggests is, if you look at all the places there are problems in Mexico, you probably want to weigh the things that are most not working. That is, you want to find the things that are most broken, that are causing the most damage, and try to focus resources on trying to improve that. I think you're right that you can't do everything at once, and how you do it, you have to do it very carefully to make sure you're doing it well. And so I'm kind of in favor of pricing these things so that you can get a sense of, okay, this is just a little bit broken, we'll save this for later, but this one is super broken. This has to be dealt right away. And what we're kind of talking about is, well, could we identify a better outcome than we're doing now? Is that possible? And how do we get from where we are now to that better outcome? And one of the things I was trying to suggest is something which is you've brought up, which is that equity matters. One of the things that's often true about a government policy is it might make society better off, but it will not always make everybody better off. And so you have to be careful about how you actually implement the policy and try to see if there's a way to try to make sure that most people are better off. But I think invariably it's true that with all public policy decisions, there's going to be somebody who doesn't like it. So there are going to be some people who are going to be opposed to it. And that's one of the things a politician has to cope with. But the point of economic analysis or academic analysis, what our job is to try to identify where are the things that are most broken, so that governments can prioritize those and try to find political solutions that actually will turn out to be better. So that's one of the things I kind of totally agree with everything you said. And the question is, what are the things which are most important for Mexico to focus on in the near term? And I guess one of the reasons why I spent so much time on water is that that's one place where I think there are substantial gains to be made, and that they are achievable. They're not hard, they're not impossible to get. And the other part I'm trying to make it clear is that you might not be able to make it perfect, but the question is, I think we can easily make it better.
Okay. Is that all, Professor Mendelsohn?
Well, those are directly to Professor Ibarrarán.
Okay.
But I guess you also talked about mitigation in pandemics. I'm not an expert in public health, but one of the things you can see is that a pandemic is very much like a global warming problem. Everybody has something to lose if we don't do a good job. And so, but yet there's lots of individual incentive not to want to bear the cost for what makes society better off. So it might make sense that everybody wear masks in public, but some people don't like it, and will tend to want to break the rules. But the problem with people who are just taking matters into their own hands, just feeling what's best for themselves, is they're not understanding that the behavior that they're engaging in could easily harm many other people. It's not just about themselves. It's about the welfare of lots of other people around them. And this is one of the difficult tasks of government, to try to get people to think about not just themselves, but what can they do to make Mexico better. This is not a moment in history where we're tending to care a lot about what's happening to our society at large. This is a moment in history where we're being a little bit selfish. We're saying, well, how am I going to get a little bit higher income? How can I get a little more consumption? I don't really care about what's going on in my society at large. So this is, I think, a general problem that society needs to recognize, or people need to recognize. They're members of a system, and they have some responsibilities to that system to make the system work. This is not just how much can the system make me better off, but how can I also contribute to this system to make Mexico a better place. Thank you.
Robert, Professor Ibarrarán, do you have something to say or to add to your comments?
Basically, I think that we both agree on these are the things that have to be done. The trick is how to really implement it, because as Robert was saying, these are very good ideas, but they have to be implemented properly. And the difficulty is to be able to find like the convergence between the valuation that different groups give to those resources, particularly water, now that the law for water is being discussed. And but other than that, I don't have many answers. I was just thinking of in terms of the Paris Accord. Well, these type of policies can be also put in to value projects that can contribute or not to the Paris Accord. For example, in terms of oil and fuel oil and coal and all these energy sources that we're now looking into, it's very efficient. It's very good from a cost point of view in some sense, but it's not if you put externalities in. And this is one of the things that Professor Mendelsohn was also referring to. You have to value the impacts that it's causing, and maybe it's causing problems on health, and that is not being factored in. And then decisions would be made very different. And this is something that I think that many academics have been thinking about and saying the energy policies that this government is putting forth are not being considerate of the impact they're having on health, on environment, and these things make them seem as very, very good projects, whereas really they are not. The impacts are huge. The same is for the Tren Maya, the same is for those bocas. So these are areas in which the use of these technical elements are very important. And I don't mean only a market value. It's a social value, and it's the value that communities also put on things. So I think that this is something interesting to keep in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria Eugenia.
Mm-hmm.
There are other questions that are related to, well, one thing that I want to stress to everybody, and I will say it in Spanish as well. One of the points Dr. Mendelsohn insists in is that a sustainable policy should select the priority components and priority policies and aspects to enhance sustainability. And I think that's a very, very important message that Dr. Mendelsohn is doing. Lo que acabo de decir es, antes de hacer otras preguntas en relación a las instituciones, es que a mí me parece muy rescatable la insistencia del profesor Mendelsohn sobre la importancia de seleccionar las áreas más importantes para intervenir o promover la sustentabilidad. En relación hay otras preguntas que las voy a formular en inglés, pero aprovecho, que tienen que ver con las instituciones. Hay dos preguntas en relación con el manejo, por ejemplo, del bosque, de las comunidades, y otra respecto al manejo del agua en las comunidades y en los municipios. Y la última tiene que ver con las instituciones para distribuir y conservar los recursos de los acuíferos y de la tierra, de los acuíferos y de la tierra superficial. Professor Mendelsohn and Ibarrarán, there are questions, 2 or 3 questions that are related to institutional arrangements. 2 of them mention the success on localities and communities and municipalities of water management, and the other has to do with the management of communities, forestry communities. And this has to do, I relate these 2 questions, especially the last one, in terms of collective property of natural resources that would be interesting to hear from you about what you think about that and how can you introduce your proposals on economic valuation of natural resources. And the last one, it's about institutions as well. And the question is, in order to maximize the present economic value of water resources, what institutional arrangements is necessary to assign fair economic value in the agricultural sector? These are the questions that I just received. Professor Mendelsohn, would you
Okay.
Please.
Yeah, that's a lot of questions. The last question is actually the easiest one to answer first. That is, how do you value water in the ag sector? You know, right now the water is given away for free, and so it seems like there's no observed price of it. So you would think that I can't value this. I can't figure out what this is worth. But if you did a study and you asked, well, each farmer is given a certain amount of water, he's allocated a certain amount of surface water, irrigation water. And what would happen if I took away 1,000 cubic feet of that, or cubic meters of that? What would happen to that farmer's net revenue? So how much the net revenue of that farmer would go down if I took away a little bit of the water that they get? That'll actually give you a measure of the scarcity value of that water to that farmer. And so you could go across the entire agricultural sector and effectively do that kind of an experiment, and it will show you what's the relative value of irrigation water to each of these farmers. Now, individual farmers probably know this already, so that's why I was thinking that if they were given an allocation of water, a certain number of acre feet, and that's the water they get each year, they would actually, if somebody said, here's a price of water, I will buy any irrigation water that is that at this price, the farmer could instantly decide how much water he'd be willing to give up and sell given that price. So I'm guessing that farmers know these prices. There is not a central center that knows these prices, but if farmers were given an allocation of water and then said, you can actually give up as much as you'd like at this market price for water, I don't think farmers would have any trouble figuring out how much water they'd be willing to sell. In terms of community management, there are some examples where having a community be in charge of a forest is an excellent idea, because the community may know all the possible uses they might want to put to that forest. So they might want to use some of it for habitat, they might want to use some for timber, they might want to use some of it for non-timber forest products. And a community would be knowledgeable enough to know how would they want to allocate that water, allocate that forest land. How would they optimally want to manage their own forest land? So there are lots of examples where community forests can work well. The same thing could, in principle, happen with a community managing water. The only thing about communities managing, well, the good thing about communities managing water is they are likely to know about how valuable the water is to each of the members of the community, assuming the community is small enough. But one of the things that is a problem with community management of water is they might not know how valuable that water is if it left the community. And so one of the things you'd want to make certain in a community-based management system is that there be some mechanism where people outside the system, outside the community, who thought that water was more valuable than the community does, they would have some way of trading money for water. Again, I'm thinking of trying to make this as voluntary as possible. So this would be the community has its water, and what I'm imagining is a case where they could voluntarily give it up for a reward, and the idea is that that's only going to be done if it turns out that water is more valuable outside the community than inside. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. María Eugenia, you have a...
So I think that I would like to follow up on what Robert was saying. I think that is kind of the challenge, right? Because we know, and I'm seeing in the chat many examples of local management of resources. The thing is how to combine that to the outer part of the community. So I'm sure, and there are very many examples of local water management, local land or forest management, and I think those are very valuable. The thing is how you integrate it, because those resources at the same time are also part of the larger country, right? So that is where the discussion comes in. And I think that can be negotiable. It's not taking away all the resources from them, but it's not also just the communities having all the resources the resources, and that because of what they will do with them is very different from what the larger, let's say, the larger area would be doing. So that's the discussion, and there can be ways to negotiate, and it's not just taking away from them, from the communities. There has to be a way to negotiate in which they get things that they need, they get the amount of water that they need, but they also let water by, let's say, to go onto other places. Like what you were saying, Antonio, of the dam by the Nile River, right? The communities outside the one that is putting the dam, let's say, will also be affected. And that is where the big problem comes, that all of these goals or views or needs need to be satisfied at the same time. So it is a very, very complex problem. It's a political problem, economic, social, development, but that's the only way towards it. If you can really, to some extent, align these things. It is very difficult in terms of policy making. It makes absolute sense theoretically, and that's very easy to discuss. But the issue of how to really do it, that is where the trick comes in.
Thank you very much. Is that all, Maria Eugenia? Yeah?
So I think that this has to do, like, I'm trying to answer the questions. And yes, recognize the very good practices that sometimes happen in some communities. Now, we don't have to idealize, because within communities there are also clashes of some that want one thing, some that want the other thing. So the political economy of all of this is really the central issue to discuss, and how you can attend to the needs of all.
Thank you very much.
Could I add one comment on top of what Professor Ibarrarán just mentioned? One of the things that's true about things like water is that historically the water was given to whoever first came to a place, and that defined who got the historic water rights. But one of the things that's true about the entire world, and certainly is true about Mexico, is that in the last 50 years, there's been an enormous amount of urbanization. And that urbanization means that the historic way we allocated resources may no longer make sense. That in fact, we need to get more resources into these cities than historically that was possible before. So one of the things that's going on is the world has changed because we've gotten all these tremendous growth in economic development through cities. But that means that some of these resources have to be shifted towards the cities because that's where these resources actually are most valuable. But historically, they all have belonged out in the rural areas. So every country is facing this tension between resources that belong, or they exist in the rural areas, but are needed in the cities. And the trick is to try to get those resources moved without impoverishing the people in the rural area.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. There are other questions. I think we have, well, we begin late, and if you agree, Professor Mendelsohn and Ibarrarán, shall we finish around in 15 minutes or so at 12 o'clock? Is that okay?
I agree.
Okay.
Yes,
great.
I have a meeting at 12 though, so I'll have to cut exactly at 12.
Okay, some minutes before 12. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes.
Then what I will do is to select. There are several questions, and I will try to synthesize them. And one is it's very interesting, and I will read it in English. It's in English. How can we establish economic incentives to invest in adaptation projects for the politicians when we know that cost of no action is higher than the cost of adaptation projects? In addition, in addition, it looks like that economic language, it is the language that politicians take care in environmental issues. I didn't understand very well the last part, but anyway, I think it's important to speak about the incentives to sustainability of politicians. And this is related to other question. The last part of this question is related to another one, which says that it's important to consider in the proposals for sustainability the language or the view of economists, since it's clear in my understanding of the questions that we can display or specify costs and benefits for society, and especially for society and individuals. The other two questions are related to institutions and communal institutions. One example is the case of Yucatan, of these questions. And what about, and the question is that if we can take and how to take lessons related to these experiences that are the decisions are made horizontally. And I think one part of the propositions of Professor Mendelsohn's go in this direction, I suppose, and I think. The other one is project of to capture water, how you say, water from rain. And that is how to basically, knowing that it's cost not very expensive, how to promote this type of use of water from rain. And I think these are the questions that are remaining, and I'm very sorry, and for the to reply and to reflect on this, we will have about 10 minutes, Professors Mendelsohn and Ibarrarán.
So again, that's a lot of questions. One of the things that I think is really important is to make a distinction between whether you're talking about climate adaptation, which is trying to adapt to the fact that the world is a different place, a warmer place, and mitigation, which is trying to stop greenhouse gases from being emitted so that we'll have less climate change in the future. It turns out it's very difficult to provide incentives for mitigation, because you're basically the beneficiary of mitigation is the entire world. So every time you spend $1 on mitigation yourself, you're making the whole world better off. And you have to be a very generous person to be willing to do that without any outside incentives. So when a government decides to have a particular mitigation plan, they've made a certain commitment to reducing their greenhouse gases. It turns out they must provide incentives to individuals to follow that plan. So the way you'd normally do that is by the government would either place a tax on carbon emissions or other greenhouse gas emissions, or they would simply limit the total amount of carbon emissions in the society, and the society would have to figure out how to meet those limits. So with mitigation, there's no question that the government needs to provide an incentive for private people to actually do it, to do mitigation. But adaptation is actually different. Many people already have an incentive to adapt. If the world gets a little bit warmer, you might look around and ask, well, is there anything I myself can do to make myself better off in this warmer world? And one of the things you'll notice is that what you used to do when the world was cooler might not be as attractive in a warmer world. Just to take a trivial example, you might like to exercise when it's a warm day, and say, well, gee, I'm going to go out in the afternoon because it's nice and it's perfectly warm at 3 o'clock, and that's when I'm going to do my exercise. But if the temperatures rise a lot, you might realize that afternoon running isn't a good place anymore, and you're actually going to shift to doing morning running simply because it's too hot in the afternoon. So that's an example of a personal adaptation that you would make. And what I'm arguing is that you already have all the incentives you need to do that. You would make that change if it makes you better off in a warmer world. And that same concept would apply to a farmer, and it would apply to firms. If there's some way they can change how they farm in a warmer world to make more money, to get higher net revenue from their farms, the idea is they already have an incentive to do that because they themselves are going to get higher net revenue. The only place that you're not going to get adaptation is when you're talking about public goods, when you're talking about protecting the environment, you're talking about protecting ecosystems, pollution control, or if you're talking about coastal defense, building a seawall, there you're going to need the government to help you. And it's the governments, local governments in particular, that would figure out how should my resources be remanaged given the world that I now see. But that local government, this is just part of their normal responsibilities. It's just, it happens that the climate is now different than it used to be. And so what this adaptation requires is revisiting what you've always done and asking, does this still make sense given the new conditions I see myself living in the future? I'm assuming horizontal, one of the other questions that was raised is cost and benefits. Most of economics was developed to study the economy. And so a lot of people think that economists only have something to say about the economy, but environmental economics is all about trying to take the basic idea of cost and benefits and apply it to environmental questions. And the same thing can happen in public health. Public health economics is talking about how would you maximize the benefits from investing in public health measures. And the idea of cost and benefits is basically just common sense. You take an action and it costs you something to take that action, and you want to know what benefits you're going to get. And the idea is you want to make sure the benefits exceed the costs. So that concept of trying to maximizing your net benefits is what runs the economy. But it turns out that idea also helps for making decisions that are outside the economy. We're not arguing that the market will solve these problems, but we're arguing this concept is the way the government should think about solving these problems, because it's just basically common sense. Horizontal decision-making, I think that what you're saying is that if we can put decisions in the hands of individuals rather than having a central government make all decisions for us, for some things we're much better off with that. And that's exactly why we think markets work for private goods. And then water capture, it turns out we might not be doing water capture as much as we should in Mexico because farmers are getting all the water they need. So they don't actually care much. The marginal value of water to them is very close to zero. They're not going to spend much money on water capture. But it could be that if the value of water gets high enough, then spending money to create ponds and things to capture water might make much more sense to them, and they'll make those investments. So again, it's the trick with trying to improve the situation in water is to try to get the water allocations better so that people will make investments like that on their own. You'll increase the you'll make everybody realize water is scarce, and they'll act like water is scarce. And so they will start to take actions like water capture in order to capture more water, to increase the supply. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. Maria Eugenia, do you have
Yes.
Okay.
I will only go into the question of adaptation, that I think it's very important. The first way to give incentives to adapt to the government, to invest in the adaptation, is valuing no action versus action. And often it's cheaper, much cheaper to prevent than to solve afterwards. So I think that in that sense, that is a basic rule that has to be acknowledged by the government and by those that make decisions in this sense. For example, Secretaría de Hacienda, and I'm sure that the minister understands this perfectly. You have to decide where to spend money, and the fact that you don't spend it in prevention means that you will have to spend it later and much more in solving the problems caused by climate change or by many other issues that are related. Now, I see the fact of adaptation as something that's very close to or very related to development. People are vulnerable because they have so many things missing in terms of infrastructure, for example. So adaptation to climate change can also meet development needs. And I think that it has to be seen like that. Often it's because there's no way to control the water when it comes in, because there's no channels for irrigation of agricultural land in some regions. And so drought hits them harder. So I think that adaptation to climate change has to be seen like a development goal and a development policy. And if it's seen that way, then it's not like an extra expenditure that you have to go into. It's something that will help people be much less vulnerable. And usually, in this sense, the most vulnerable are the poorest in many cases. Not always, because there can be very vulnerable people in Miami Beach, but the most vulnerable in many cases are the poorest people. And if you increase their capacities and their well-being, make the proper investments in the region, then you will be hitting two goals. You will be helping them increase their income, not lose so much when there's a disaster and whatnot, and at the same time adapt to climate change. So I think that adaptation is a development goal. And I think that I will have to leave you at this point, but I just want to thank everybody for inviting me. Landy, thank you very much for inviting me to this conference. Antonio, thank you very much for moderating. And Robert, it was a pleasure sharing the floor with you.
Thank you very much. Muchas gracias a ti.
Thank you,
Eugenia.
It's a pleasure as well.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so I will quit.
Okay. Thank you very much, Robert. It was a pleasure to hear you. And there's lots of things to be discussed. For example, the issue of adaptation, that it's a very, very important. My understanding is that there are two views. You have a different view about it. But anyway, thanks a lot, Robert, and I hope to follow these conversations, and all the best for you.
Thank you very much for inviting me here. I appreciate it.
Thanks. Muchas gracias a todos los asistentes y espero que haya sido más o menos fluido el reto que tuve de traducir algunas cosas al inglés. Muchas gracias a todos y buen día, y los esperamos el viernes de la semana entrante.